Trace, should we start by talking about Mormonism and your experiences of being raised within Mormonism, but also your experiences of leaving it?
Mormonism was always interesting for me in that I'm I think a seventh generation Mormon, if you count it all out, which is as far back as Mormonism has existed. So you look at my family history and you look at my family culture and you look at my local culture, and it was as embedded within Mormonism as it is possible to be. The town I came from was about 95% Mormon, to the point where in our neighborhood, we had a map of our neighborhood that was, here's our local church group. And we knew that very specific, very few houses that were not part of the church, just by happenstance. It took me until I was about 10, 11 years old before I really internalized that the majority of the world was not Mormon. The thing about Mormonism as a religion is that it's not you go to church on Sunday and then that's it. That's your religion. That's your experience. It is something that encompasses every facet of life. So some of my earliest memories are every night sitting down with my family and reading the Book of Mormon or the Bible together, where my parents would read a couple of verses and then they'd turn to me or my older brother and they'd say a few words and they have us repeat that to read them, to read our part with it. That was every single day in my childhood. Growing up, you have things like in high school, you would have 1 hour a day devoted to religious study. Like on Tuesday evenings, you would do church activities for that evening. Of course, there are pretty rigorous commandments in terms of monthly fast, tithing, the well-known no drinking, smoking, coffee, tea, drugs, any of that, and pretty wide-ranging set of commandments in general, alongside the thing that really strikes me about its social organization is that even from a very young age, you're expected to actively participate in a lot of ways. So you'll see even very small children go up on Sunday and on what's called Fast Sunday, the first Sunday of the month when everyone's fasting, no food or water for 24 hours ideally. But people fudge it. They all fudge it. Anyway, and you'll hear little kids go up and say, I know Joseph Smith was a prophet. I know the church is true. I know Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And you'll hear, it's disconcerting for me looking back on it because, you see 5-year-olds very, very convinced that this is what they're supposed to say, that they know these things, that they're very certain of these things. But that's the environment you're in. Pretty young, you'll get some sort of like calling where you'll go and say, collect fast offerings from people, collect money to give to the poor from people, or you'll lead a youth group, or perhaps you'll play the piano or the organ for things, even when you're a young teenager. So from a very early age, it's extremely immersive, extremely all-encompassing, and it defines really every facet of your life.
And looking at it now, as someone who's left the church and as an adult, what elements do you see in that experience of yours that encourage people to stay within the church? What are the sort of social technologies that were used, which allowed, 7 generations of your family to stay within this social niche?
Yeah, in terms of social technologies, I think one of the biggest ones is the strong emphasis in all of that, with it being your whole life, so especially in Utah, so intimately connected to every facet of your life. It's not just your belief. It's not just an abstract thing. It's every day you are around other people who believe the same things you do, who affirm these things, who tell you should be doing these things, who tell you should be thinking these things, or communicate in things other than words that you do. You grow up with the music of it. You grow up with every thought of yours really influenced in some way by it. Every aspect of your morality influenced in very deep running ways by it. And you have a pretty strict set of standards that you're not just told, hey, these are the standards, but you'll go into like interviews with your church leaders every once in a while, and they'll sit you down and say, so let's talk about, are you meeting this standard? 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 Which feels pretty invasive from a modern progressive sensibility for some people, but it's, very natural growing up Mormon. That's just what's done. There are people within Mormonism who do just go to church occasionally on Sunday, things like that. But it's much, much, much less than in something like Catholicism. Mm-hmm. The expectation is very much you're in or you should be in the sense of that there's no Christmas and Easter Mormons who feel like, oh yeah, I'm definitely Mormon and definitely on this track. They'll, there are some who have the conviction inside them, but they'll hedge it. They'll say, I'm Mormon, but I'm not a very good Mormon, whatever. A much higher percent than in a lot of other religions of people who identify as it attend weekly. Just that's part of the framework. It's a very, very high demand religion.
I think about 1 or 2% of the people who call themselves Church of England attend weekly. So there's some pretty amazing numbers. Why do you think that Mormonism has proved more sticky, at least so far? I know that there has been some, I'm sure we'll get on to this, I know there's been a drop in the fertility rate, for instance, within Mormonism. But compared to, let's say, Catholics in America, Mormonism has been much more successful at retaining people.
Mormonism catches up to trends in the broader United States about 30, 40 years late in a lot of ways. And that's been happening since the beginning. Mormonism started with polygamy, and then eventually that became socially and politically untenable, and they figured out a way to change it and to drop that part of their faith and to integrate more fully into the mainstream. Or they had institutionalized racial discrimination for the first large chunk of it. And then as the civil rights movement happened, and as more attention and more conversations and more questions started going in there, eventually they get a revelation that undoes all this institutionalized racial discrimination and so forth. Again, a while after broader society does that. And I think it's basically, in a lot of ways, they're doing what everyone else does, but with a speed brake applied. And in the context of a very strong, demanding culture that makes very specific expectations that do keep them separate to some extent. And in the context of a place where a good chunk of them, not all, but a good chunk of them are in a place that is dominated by that culture. Where a Catholic in America, there are a lot of Catholics in America, but there's no state in America that is as defined by Catholicism in any way, shape, or form as Utah is dominated by Mormonism. And having that distinct culture, and I think one reason it's fading, is because everything is becoming more interconnected, but particularly as it was growing up for these 150 years or so, most of the people are just here in this desert building a society together and working with each other to figure that out. And that goes a long way.
So do you think that time lag, which doesn't bode well in terms of where Mormonism will be at in 30, 40 years, right, potentially, but do you think that time lag is an effect of this early marginalization? And it seems to be there's a sort of frontier culture almost, right? Not only obviously going out into a hostile desert environment functions as a frontier, but also in terms of being in opposition to wider American society on things like polygamy. Do you think that might have forged a more insular religion?
Yeah, I definitely think it had a role to play in it. You see this with a lot of early movements. You see some leader who is going to be wildly controversial and wildly inventive and does some clever things and a lot of really out there things and gathers a group around him. And Joseph Smith is one of the most interesting figures in American history in that regard. That man's biography is like no other in terms of how full of a life he lived, in and out of prison, getting tarred and feathered constantly, moving from place to place, gathering an army at one point, running for president at one point, like you name it, and it's somewhere in his bio, in and around founding this church and gathering a huge group of people to follow him. And he was wildly inventive and wildly out there by the standards of his day in very many ways. But since him, no other Mormon leader really, Brigham Young, the next one after they went to Utah, tried to add a few things in the same way Joseph Smith was building so much of the doctrine up, but he wasn't nearly as convincing in it wasn't nearly as coherent in the certain way that Joseph Smith was coherent in it, and the specific things he added. He tried to say, add this doctrine of explaining how Adam is God in a sense, and that didn't catch on, things like that. But then after that, the way the leadership structure worked, it was basically a seniority-based leadership structure, where the people who have been appointed to the highest positions for the longest time are the ones who will eventually become the next prophets down the line, and they will appoint the people beneath them, and they'll appoint the people beneath them, and they'll appoint the people beneath them all the way down, which leads to a very institutionally conservative organization, a very institutionalist-focused organization. And in particular, to touch more directly on your question, you have all this wild tension, opposition, knowing that they're on the outs, going from place to place, settling in the desert. But at the same time, Mormonism was always very fundamentally American in its ideals. And so even as it left the country of America to go to Utah, to go to what it called the territory of Deseret, which was part of Mexico at the time, briefly, even with all of that, they always wanted to be mainstream, and they always pictured themselves being mainstream. They always pictured themselves being, at once a peculiar people, at once set apart, and being accepted and embraced by the public. And so you see throughout their history, Atlantic journalist McKay Coppins has done a great article on this. You see basically for 150 years almost of their history, they're really working to slowly become accepted by the American mainstream, become embraced by it to one extent or another. And it's almost working. You get to about the Reagan era, and Mormons have become culturally, in a lot of ways, this traditionalist faith and family conservatives, right when that's on the upswing. And right at that point, American culture shifted really dramatically. And in particular, the fight over gay marriage left them suddenly on the back foot in a way that they, just as they had finally caught up, just as they had finally sort of felt like they were integrated, suddenly they found themselves in deep tension with that same culture once more.
So despite these efforts to become a mainstream over time, to what extent, even before, say, gay marriage enters the scene as a controversial issue, to what extent do Mormons retain this kind of weirdness? So I know there's I'm saying this as someone who's British, right? So my familiarity with their context with America is limited. There's the weird underwear stuff. There's still the historical association with polygamy, even though that's no longer practiced, I assume. To what extent is that outsider status retained still? Oh,
it's very much retained. And it's very much, particularly within Mormonism, there's very much an identity built around we were a persecuted minority and we are a persecuted minority, built around, our ancestors were driven out of their homes, were driven into the desert, and we built this from scratch out here to do our thing where they couldn't get to us, to have religious freedom where the rest of you would leave us be. And that is deeply entrenched in Utah culture, because everything you look around and see in Utah was built by Mormons, and it was built by Mormons who joined this movement to go there because that was the place where they could be Mormon, as they saw it, and credibly as they saw it. Well, there is a lot of gray areas one could go into in the disputes if they wanted to look at this history of it and everything. The simple reality was that as they were moving from place to place, it was technically legal to kill a Mormon in Missouri until 1976. That's when that order was finally repealed. The underwear stuff and polygamy, that's stuff that others bring up, but that's not really what Mormons would bring up as, this is what sets us apart. The things that Mormons would tend to notice a lot more would be, say, cultural things. Like Mormons strongly discourage people watching R-rated movies culturally. And so a big chunk of American culture is suddenly these sexual violent movies that we're not supposed to see, and we're going to set them aside. Or Mormons don't swear, and most Mormons don't swear, and a lot of them will feel awkward in places with a lot of swearing. And so something that is very, very normal in the rest of American culture, Mormons will look around and be like, I don't really, like this. I don't really fit in here.
Hence, like Mitt Romney saying things like heck and all of these that
Absolutely.
sound really old timey and I think quite endearing, but I suppose quite distinctively Mormon.
Yes, and I say the same. I still don't swear, so that's one thing I've kind of kept as a holdover, in part because I like to picture my writing in some ways towards my younger self, and I want to write in a way that I would have been comfortable with reading. In part as a reaction to that sense of you do feel like a cultural outsider as a Mormon, and growing up as a Mormon, some of my strongest experiences were, of course, I'm married to a man now. I didn't think of myself as gay in any way back then. And in fact, quite the opposite. I was, hopping online at 13, whatever, on Pokemon forums, from a position where I'm used to everyone in Utah basically sharing the same social conservative mores. And I'm hopping on trying to argue that, of course, gay marriage is wrong. And of course, gays are disgusting freaks and everything. And it didn't go super well. A lot of people were not super receptive to my message. And there were experiences like that. And then anytime as a Mormon, particularly online, when you shared your faith in a lot of different places, you expected to get sometimes some really ugly pushback, sometimes looking at it from an outsider point of view, plenty of fair pushback, but you don't really notice any of the fairness when you're on the other end of it. You just notice a lot of people getting angry at you and trying to drag you again and again towards the same old topics whenever you just happen to tangentially mention this thing. And so my childhood, my teenager years, were defined at once by being in Utah in this deeply, deeply Mormon space where I was very much enmeshed in that culture, and online where I felt like an outcast and I felt like no one would understand if I said the things I really wanted to say or tried to put forward my perspectives. Everyone would hate me. And I think that's the experience that a lot of young Mormons have.
I'm sure in many cases would function to draw people back to the church, to the community.
Oh, absolutely. Especially particularly if you think you're pretty smart and you're in a group like that. What will happen is you will have a much, much, much more familiarity with a lot of the arguments in and around it than other people will. And a lot of people will choose the dumbest things to harp on and will spend a great deal of time in ways that you feel like you can knock down really confidently. And so you are placed in an environment where you're constantly exposed to people who feel like they need to take pot shots at you, that you're prepared to handle, that you've already internalized answers to, that you're already set on. And so you look around and you're like, and you're going to be exposed mostly to the most hostile and the most aggressive ones. So you'll look around and your experience with ex-Mormons will be that these guys are all jerks who hate us. And your experience with people who want to argue against Mormonism will be these people don't know what they're talking about. And it's very, very easy to retrench in that. Very easy to retrench based on that sort of reaction.
Obviously, lots of things banned within Mormonism. The internet, though, what's the attitude towards the internet? If you're encountering outsiders on the internet from quite a young age, was that normal?
It's not normal. I was very insistent about it, and there wasn't really anything my family could do to stop me, I would say. I have always been fascinated with computers and always been fascinated with the world of online. And as soon as I could get online and start looking around, I did get online and start looking around. And it's not a typical Mormon experience. I think, it's certainly becoming more common. At the time, I very much experienced it as transgressive when I would say go to Reddit and see a bunch of people swearing and a bunch of anti-Mormon stuff that I'd see popping around and things like that. I'd be like, it's probably not the best to be here, but what are you going to do? There are interesting conversations going on. You're a young, curious person. There was always tension around it, basically. I was never comfortable online. I was never feeling like, yeah, this is a space that is full of the Spirit of the Lord and the space I should be. It was always, there is a lot of sketchy stuff here, but I'm just really fascinated, and I can't get the interactions I can get here anywhere else, so be it. But I never really resolved that growing up.
Do you think you would have left the church if you hadn't had access to the internet?
I don't think I am the sort of personality that ever could have stayed in long term. And the reason for that, so there was a Mormon apostle in the 1980s, Boyd K. Packer, who gave a speech that I think was really prescient from an ex-Mormon perspective, not in a way that flatters him as much as he would want it to be. But basically, he was talking about how the three major threats to Mormonism are so-called intellectuals, feminists, and the LGBT movement. And basically, his idea was that each of those are deeply in tension with it, and all those people will cause problems for it. And I think basically Mormonism works very, very well for people who are not in those categories a lot of the time, for people who are not sympathetic to one of those categories a lot of the time. If you are sympathetic to one of those categories, you will experience a lot of tension and a lot of internal struggle and a lot of dissonance. And for me, what that looked like, yes, online contributed to it, diving through a bunch of apologetics and counter-apologetics and looking at all the arguments, but rational argumentation, even for someone who fancies himself rational and whatever, and especially as a kid, I would call myself a skeptic and call myself super rational and whatever. The emotional core changes where someone lands a lot more than reason in a lot of cases, and someone will stay someplace as long as it is fulfilling their needs. So as a teenager, I pretty quickly came across a lot of questions that I realized were very difficult to answer about Mormonism. And even though I told myself I had answers, I knew on some level that poking it a little too much was getting me into a position where I would have to say either I'm wrong or the church is wrong, and the church can't be wrong. And so then I would just back away from that line of inquiry and say, I'm not going to worry about that. I'll think about that later. And I'll refocus on the things the church tells me to focus on, which is prayer, scripture, living it, and understanding the truth of it via living it. And so I had, a period of time as a teenager diving into apologetics. But the whole time, never at any point was I the sort of spiritually convinced person who was able to stand up and say, like everyone I saw around me, oh yes, I know this is true. Yes, I know that Joseph Smith was a prophet, that Jesus Christ was the Savior, all of that. I could never, ever say that with confidence. And even as I was leaving on my Mormon mission, at 18 years old, I stand up in front of my local church group of, say, 400 people, however many, and I say, look, I hope this is true. I believe it's true. I don't know. I know it's good. I know that my experiences in it have been broadly good, but I don't know that it's true. And I was very aware throughout that whole time that the questions that I was seeing, and inevitably I would have come across them in some way. You don't live in this day and age and not find them somewhere. So maybe 100 years ago, I wouldn't have confronted the theology as directly, but as it was, I was always going to confront the theology directly. I was always going to come to the gaps in the theology and history. I was always going to grapple with them. And more than that, I was always going to grapple with never being able to convince myself that the path Mormons told me would lead me to truth was doing anything for me. They say, pray and ask God, and you'll get a witness of the truth. I spent day after day after day on my knees, begging, crying, what have you, just please, anything to let me know that I am not throwing my life away on a fantasy. And I spent years in that position trying to find that, and very bitterly, through a lot of really, really unpleasant experiences over time, and through a period where I realized I felt like my mind more and more was being torn in two as I tried to keep explaining everything in terms of this is how this fits into God's plan. This is how this makes sense in God's plan. This is how this could make sense. This is how this could make sense. This is how this commandment makes sense. This is how this doctrine makes sense. This is how I can resolve this. This is how I can fit this, and this is how I can piece this in. And so I was building up a really almost coherent image of it all, but it kept not fitting, and I knew it wasn't fitting, and it was driving me crazy. It was breaking my mind in two, and eventually, after my mission, things came to a peak with it right at the end of my mission. After my mission, I spent 2 years just kind of stumbling around spiritually, hoping like maybe I'll figure out how to stay in or something, even though I don't think I can ever actually believe in it properly. And then eventually I realized, look, I need to be honest about my own beliefs. I need to be honest about thinking that, no, these things where I've been trying to convince myself I am wrong, I'm not actually wrong about these things. these things that don't make sense. They actually don't make sense. And I just happened to have been born into a culture that was fundamentally founded on some deep running errors alongside everything I enjoyed about it. And it took me a long time to come to terms with that, but I think that would have always happened. I don't think there was a way for me to avoid it with my personality and my approach to things.
Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. A lot of people would sort of read the simple version of your biography, like ex-Mormon, now married to a man, and say, oh, cool, yeah, I get that. You know, clearly being gay was the problem. But actually, it seems from what you've said that, you know, the 3 categories of sort of people who struggle to fit within Mormonism, intellectuals, feminists, LGBT, it's actually the first one, if anything, that caused you the spiritual crisis. Yeah. Absolutely.
And that's something that, obviously, I understand why people will take that impression at a high level. I can't do anything about that. I recognize that. But it is something that it's important for me to be clear about, because my whole time in Mormonism, I agreed with, towards the end, I was finally getting to a point where I was saying, okay, look, if Mormonism changes its mind on gay marriage, first I will leave Mormonism and then I will support gay marriage. But I was always willing to be in line with the church's position on it and didn't experience tension with that. And crucially, didn't think of myself as gay, didn't recognize any sort of attraction to anyone in particular. It was only after I left Mormonism, only after I stepped away from that whole environment, that I felt like I had space to think about any of that at all. And it was only after that that I noticed any attraction to men. So the high level impression that people would get, yeah, it had nothing whatsoever to do with it. It was 2 completely different pathways. And it was very much this intellectualism and deep running frustration trying to make all the pieces fit together that drove me mad through my late teens and early 20s.
Yeah, I think intellectualism, I guess, is probably the right word. I know exactly what you're describing. You know what it makes me think of, although this will sound like a real non sequitur. It says this, I'm sure you're familiar with British politician Enoch Powell, mostly famous for being anti-immigration, although there were all sorts of other positions he took which were controversial. He was actually very popular in his day. There's this line that one of his parliamentary colleagues said about him later in life, which was that poor Enoch, he was driven mad by the remorselessness of his own logic. And I think the remorselessness of his own logic is a really good line, because it does. I mean, Mormons, right, they have a reputation for being smart, right? It's not like this is there are Mormon universities, lots of, you know, it's not like this isn't a stupid group of people, okay, right? But this type of person who is very smart, but also very, very concerned with internal consistency, it's that personality, right, who is really going to struggle within Mormonism, do you think?
Absolutely. 100% with all of that. What I'll add with it is that I have thought about it a lot because, you know, there are a lot of smart people who I respect who stay within Mormonism and who find a way to reconcile it. And in a lot of cases, I think what it is having other hobbies, is having other things that occupy their intellectual energies and occupy their thirst for understanding and occupy those parts of their curiosity. They don't feel the need to ruminate in quite the same way over all these very specific parts of it. They're concerned with other things. They have lives to live. They have families. They have kids. They have jobs. They have hobbies. They have other things that occupy plenty of their time, and it's easy to go along. Or, you know, there are some who find their nuanced, careful reconciliations with theology. And I think there are productive wrestles that people can have like that. Some do it more successfully than others. And some people I really respect and like stay within it and find a way to make it work. But yes, it was, that sort of consistency was always critical to me and impossible to attain within it. And I mean, that's also why, a lot of ex-Mormons stepping away from it dive very naturally and very much into progressivism. And that would have been a very natural environment from a social perspective for me stepping away from Mormonism to jump into, to be accepted, date a man, hop into this milieu, embrace all of that. But very frankly, there are a lot of inconsistencies and falsehoods in that milieu also. And I took one look at them and they drove me crazy too. And I was like, I'm not doing this. I absolutely will not jump from one culture that I actually liked, because I always liked Mormon culture growing up, and my family was in it. My parents, my siblings, the people I loved, my grandparents, my aunts and uncles, everyone I cared about was in this culture, and I had stepped away from that. I wasn't about to just dive into something that I didn't even particularly get on with. So that was no more consistent in the ways that really mattered to me. So progressivism was just never really an option for me from it for the same reason.
You're driven mad by the remorses of your own logic, but when it comes to a different ideology, being nonconformist is tough. You can see why most people aren't. It's not a choice. It's just, I think it's a personality trait, mostly, but it not only makes for an easier life, but I think it also probably makes for much healthier communities. I mean, Mormonism, Mormons believe some weird stuff, but like it works. It's a flourishing community in all the important ways.
It does, and in many of the important ways it is. Yes, absolutely. And that's the thing the paradox of my own position is that I'm the sort of nonconformist who really does like to defend tribalism and really does like to defend group identity and really does like to defend the notion of working together with people who you find common purpose with towards higher goals. And I'm conscious that the path I've taken and the choices I've made have left me with a very loose coalition and a very wish-washy coalition with in as much as I have a tribe, it's the sort of people who insist that they don't have a tribe and that they're free thinkers and that they all happen to be coming to more or less the same conclusions completely on their own. And who knows how that's happening, but they're all very smart and individualistic with all of it. I look at that, and ultimately, I think that it is correct at this point that I don't have a tribe. I'm not the sort to compromise on those things, but I don't know that I would be satisfied 20 years looking back if I don't have a much larger group unified around much more commonality than I have right now. Because I do think that sort of thing is important. And I do think community building, conscious community building together towards healthy causes is valuable. And I lost a lot of that stepping away from Mormonism, and I knew exactly what it was like, and I knew exactly how valuable a lot of it was, and exactly how difficult to replace a lot of it was. I knew that I could go to any city in the world, almost, and I could walk in the doors of church on Sunday and immediately have a built-in community there. I knew that wherever I moved, I would have friends, I would have people who understood me and who I understood. Sort of, I say all of this, and then at the same time, my experience with it was always, but I don't quite agree, but there are these tensions and everything. But noticing that doesn't remove noticing all the really healthy communitarian aspects of it.
You mentioned that a lot of ex-Mormons dive straight into progressivism when they leave. Is it not? Is becoming an atheist once you've left Mormonism, is that more common than joining some other Christian denomination?
Oh, absolutely.
Interesting.
At least, so I'm going to caveat this. There are different categories of ex-Mormons. There are some who are the ones who might be more wishy-washy, who just kind of drift away from the church, or who aren't like extremely online, who aren't part of ex-Mormon communities, things like that, but who just like grew up Mormon, or maybe their parents got baptized or whatever. And those, they could go any which way. But the ones who are like in ex-Mormon communities, or the ones who are sharing a lot about their experiences online or being very active about any of it, almost all of them, some exceptions, but almost all of them will become more or less atheists, or will have very vaguely defined religious impulses after. And part of that is that within Mormonism, you learn built-in answers to why are you not part of any of these other denominations? What's wrong with all of these? Because the whole mythos of Mormonism is that they were all wrong, that they were all crucially flawed, that the Church of Jesus Christ did need to be restored because here were all these errors. And so you have all of these flaws real, and a lot of them real. Some of them maybe only flaws from within Mormon theology, but a lot of them more convincing than that, that you look at about all these other things. Not to pick too much on Anglicans, but you look at it and say, well, for example, here's this church that split off of Catholicism because some dude wanted to divorce his wife. And
it's a fair point.
And so that's the sort of thing that Mormons would look at from it, and that's how Mormons would react to it. And, Catholicism, they'd look at and be like, well, the Protestants were completely right about Catholics. Here were all these problems with it, and how can they say they're the true church with all of these flaws that people accurately noticed in them? And so you spend your time thinking along those patterns a lot as a Mormon. So when you step away from it, it's not, okay, which of these churches was I wrong about, so much as, all right, and it turns out that all of these explanations also fall short, so I guess there's just not really anything left in any of this.
The whole thing collapses.
Yes.
Yeah. What do people tend to do politically? So if they become non-Christian, do they also become less socially conservative? Is that a kind of classic path for ex-Mormons?
Oh, very much so. I do want to touch for a moment on the politics of Mormons, in that it's not quite what people expect looking at the right wing in America in general. Mormons, obviously in 2016, about 22% of Utah voted for Evan McMullen, a third-party candidate who had no shot in the general election because they really loathed Trump in a lot of ways. And, another chunk voted for Democrats. But Utah is one of the most Republican states in the country, or was one of the most Republican states in the country. However, Utah's brand of Republicanism was very much that, Mitt Romney is sort of the exemplar of what a lot of Utah's and a lot of what the institutional LDS instinct towards politics is. It's a lot of, we want to be respectable, we want to build up institutions, we want to be clean, and we want to be loving, and we want to be this sort of compassionate, faith-driven, faith and family conservatism that is focused on institutional structure and focused on tradition and focused on all of these things. And so as the populist wing has swept the Republican Party, and as it's become much more burn it all down, we must tear down the institutions, forget about being nice, it's time to play dirty, we want to be crass, we want to roll in the mud like those other guys, a lot of this. Mormonism really doesn't do well with that sort of thing. And so, there's a tension within Mormonism, because some Mormons, naturally, as the Republican Party goes that way, and start leaning more into this anti-institutional stuff. But you still see the institutional Mormon church do things like, no, we really like refugees, we really like immigration, things like that, or we support vaccines, everyone should get vaccinated. And they barely even, the political considerations for it, like I'm sure that they're like 80, 90-year-old men who are saying some of these things from the top down, and they don't make a lot of political statements, but like, they're not thinking of it in these very partisan political terms. That is to say, there's this struggle going on with all of that. And so people leaving it are stepping away from all of that. But yes, what happens stepping away from all of that, from that pretty interesting struggle, is that most of them will look at it, and most people, because people don't really, as much as everyone will tell you they changed their mind because they learned new facts. People change their minds because they have an unmet need. People change their positions because they have an unmet need. And because there's some tension in their world that is not being resolved until they change positions. And the most natural way out of Mormonism, and the most natural unmet need, particularly in modern culture, as modern culture becomes much more institutionally progressive, is that your good progressive instincts will be kicking back against your Mormon instincts. And your one set of institutionalism will be kicking back against this other set of institutionalism. And you're wanting to be a good person by being respectful to gay people and including gay people and supporting gay marriage and being a feminist and supporting all these things is kicking against your patriarchal homophobic church and what have you. And so very much the most natural way to being an ex-Mormon for a lot of people is that is the tension that is somewhat there. Or even if that isn't specifically the tension, as soon as you abandon this notion that there's this divine guidance there, first of all, you start to notice that there were a lot of ways where you were convincing yourself of things that were not true, and you were letting them impact your worldview in very deep ways. So, for example, I look at Mormons will talk about how in 1978 there was a policy change about Black people being able to get the priesthood, and what they don't internalize nearly in the same way is the extent to which, back in the 1940s or whatever, church leadership was very emphatically adamant that Black people were fundamentally, from before this life began, unequal, and that they had been sent to bodies where they were unworthy of the priesthood and unworthy of some of these blessings of the gospel because they had been less faithful in a previous life, and that racial intermarriage was and had always been demonic, essentially, had been completely abhorrent to the eyes of any faithful person. And over time, that warps, and people sort of forget that everyone a generation before very sincerely believed that, and very sincerely believed that that was very deeply part of the doctrine. And so when you're stepping away, you look at it and say, I was letting this system influence my thinking in a lot of ways, and it clearly, by its own standards, in the past, influenced people's thinking in those ways, in ways that were against its own standards now and against my own ethics now. Therefore, it makes sense to recoil against this in a lot of ways and push against this in a lot of ways is very much the ex-Mormon frame and what leads them instinctively to progressivism. And I don't think they're wholly wrong in that, or I think there is a lot of good reason for them to land in that position.
Briefly on this race question, am I right that Mormons are still overwhelmingly English? In terms of, you did 23andMe analysis of current Mormons, they would overwhelmingly come from the British Isles.
In Utah, yes. At this point, Mormonism is a worldwide church. There are more members outside the United States than there are inside the United States. You have, say, the island of Tonga in the Pacific. 50% of them were baptized Mormon at some point.
Wow,
so you have these pockets in different places. But in terms of Utah, in terms of the pioneers, in terms of what I would almost call Mormonism as an ethnicity, yes, it is very much Anglo. So yeah, my 23andMe, for example, my ancestry is primarily Britain and Wales, speck of Finland in there, speck of other Scandinavian countries, but very, very British. And that is, just what Mormon, central Utah Mormon DNA generally is.
We're probably very distant cousins. I'm 98%
Probably.
British Isles or something. So, yeah. How has Mormonism spread so successfully? Is it partly, you mentioned the Mormon mission. Is it partly because of that? Because of there's so much work goes into evangelism? Yeah.
I mean, they would certainly say so. And I don't think they're wrong in that. I think particularly in the past, Mormon evangelism was really successful in a lot of ways, and missionaries would go out, they'd spend 2 years, and a lot of them would convince a lot of people, or would convince enough people to get it to spread. And, you have a culture of every member is expected to spread it. Every member is expected to look for any opportunities to invite those who are ready to come join with them and everything. And I would say that in the past, it was a lot easier, perhaps, for people to do it with more conviction. At this point, I do think that Mormon evangelism, in a lot of ways, is stuck trying to persuade people that it fits with their worldview almost as much as they should fit with its worldview. That is, it still says the same things, and it still tries to bring people into the same frame. But we live in an age of increasing secularization, and we live in an age where a lot of people are increasingly skeptical of the sort of claims that Mormonism would make about how to find truth, where people will look online and look for information about it versus just saying, yeah, sure, I'll read this book and pray about it. And if I get a warm feeling about it, then that must mean that this is from God and I should devote my whole life to this. You get some going that way still, but the frame that most people are in isn't really a frame where that's persuasive at this point. So yes, for a while, this evangelism was very successful with it. I don't think that this evangelism will be or has been particularly adaptive to modern developed countries, in as much as the church is still growing. And I haven't looked specifically at the numbers recently, but it's been plateauing and in some places declining. It is in developing countries like Latin America, Africa. I went on my mission in Australia. We worked mostly with immigrants. There weren't Australians who wanted to talk about Mormonism, very many, like not native Aussies. So we would mostly chat with overseas Chinese students or the Pacific Islanders in the area or this or that, just because those were the people who would chat with us. And I think that's pretty inevitable to continue to cause issues for its evangelism in this day and age.
Interesting. I believe the same thing is true of Jehovah's Witnesses. That they're, I know I'm kind of familiar with Jehovah's Witnesses in London, overwhelmingly non-white in terms of people who are drawn to it.
Yeah, I think that it will be the case for any traditionally evangelical faith at this point. And, you do see resurgence of people who are coming back to Christianity for cultural reasons. And making, some of them will make the very trad-cath argument, online trad-cath, neo-reactionary argument, what have you. Some of them will return towards other high church aesthetics or high church culture and be really culturally drawn to those things. If you're drawn to it for that, you can make a case for Mormonism for that, but Mormonism isn't going to make its own case for that. Mormonism is going to say, no, we're true, and you should join us because Joseph Smith was a prophet. It's a lot more natural for someone like that to be drawn to something with more history and a deeper theology and a longer claim to tradition if what they want is this tradition and this culture or aesthetic or what have you. So some churches are not experiencing growth due to this traditionalist resurgence, but certainly experiencing a shift in composition due to it. I think Mormonism is unlikely to experience that in the same way to the same degree.
I believe that Mormon fertility has dropped a lot just recently. Although, interestingly, I believe that Utah is the only state in the US where people who are more educated have more children than people who are less educated, which seems to be down to, which is down to the Mormon influence. But what's going on there, do you think, with falling fertility? Is it symptomatic of greater secularization in general?
It's absolutely symptomatic of greater secularization in general. Yeah, that's the long and short of it. Mormons are taught to have lots of kids. They're taught that everyone should become a parent. Everyone should marry. Everyone should become a parent. It's not like, say, Catholicism, where priests are expected to be single and where some people have callings higher than marriage for themselves or callings different than marriage for themselves. If you have any position in leadership in Mormonism, you are a married man. Or, leadership over the woman, you are a married woman. If you are paying attention and listening and really trying to live as a Mormon ought to live, you are marrying young, you are having kids, and you are having potentially lots of kids.
How young are we talking nowadays?
Very early 20s. Okay. My parents got married when they were 18 and 19, I want to say. Maybe 19 and 20.
It fits with your thing about it being 30 to 40 years behind. Because actually, average age for women to get married in America in the 80s was surprisingly young, early 20s or mid-20s. So, yeah, that wasn't that crazy within living memory.
It's still, last I checked, and, it's been years. It's been 7-ish years since I lived in Utah in any long-term capacity. So I'm not as in touch with Utah culture as I once was. When I was there and when I was at BYU and so forth, it was still very normal for people to have like 6-month courtships and then get married at 20 or at 21, for men to come home from their missions and find a young college student at BYU and get married within the year while they're, doing that, studying. That's quite normal, especially because, Mormonism doesn't have big weddings, big expensive weddings. You just go to a Mormon temple, you get married there, and then probably you have a reception in a church building in the cultural hall of it, and they pull out the church tablecloths and everything, and it can cost like $100 maybe if you want it to. Anyway, so it's very much a culture of get married early and do all of that. But yes, it has been changing. Mormonism has not escaped the wave of secularization. And I don't think there's strong reason to predict it to really escape the wave of secularization. And ultimately, that has meant that their fertility also dropped below replacement recently. And that, we'll see what happens down the road with them. But as far as I can tell, at least in developed countries, in the strongest economies and everything, Mormons are not going to be that far off the curve of everyone else. And you're seeing a lot of that start to play out. So it's still the youngest state by far, age-wise. They still have the most kids. Then I think maybe South Dakota or something. But it's not that far ultimately behind the trend.
Do you know if that's because of people having smaller families, those who have families, or is it because of lots of people not having families?
It's always going to be a mix, definitely smaller families are a part of it. Look, I mean, I can talk about looking at my own family over the generations. You have 8 kids, 6 kids in one generation, then 4 in the next, and then the next generation, all of the kids are growing up and a few of them are getting married and fewer of them are having kids and none of them are having a lot of kids. And that's just, there has been a generational tide change.
It's a pretty classic sequence across a lot of families across the 20th century. The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.